Okay, so you want to buy a shopping mall, fill an empty building with stores, and watch the rent. Checks roll in every month. Hundreds of shoppers walking past your stores every single day, and every one of them pays you just for the privilege of standing there. Sounds simple. It isn't. And the story of how malls actually make money and how they actually die is one of the strangest stories in all of real estate. Before you make a single dollar, you have to survive buying the thing or building it. A large regional mall is never a small purchase. Building one from scratch, with the parking structures, the plumbing, the electrical systems, the climate control, every permit that goes with it, can run into the hundreds of millions of dollars before a single store opens its doors. The land alone can cost tens of millions. Buying an existing mall is usually cheaper up front, but that's where things get interesting, because not all malls are the same mall. There's a huge gap between what the industry calls Class A malls and everything below them. A Class A mall has a luxury anchor, high sales per square foot, and a waiting list of brands wanting in. Those trade for enormous sums, sometimes north of $1 billion, because the income is stable and predictable. Then there are the malls, 2 or 3 tiers down, and some of those have sold for a tiny fraction of what it costs to build them. Rolling Acres Mall in Akron, Ohio, sold for $2.75 million in the early 2000s, after the previous owner had paid over $33 million for it. Mall, that once held more than 140 stores, eventually changed hands again for well under $2 million, and it kept losing tenants after that. So here's the first thing nobody tells you when they picture owning a mall. You're not really buying a building, you're buying a bet on a neighborhood. And the price tag tells you almost everything about which bet you're making. Most mall owners today don't own them the way you'd own a house. They own them through a structure called a real estate investment trust, or REIT, a company that's legally required to pay out nearly all of its profit to shareholders in exchange for skipping corporate income tax. Ordinary investors can buy shares in a mall-owning REIT for the price of a coffee without ever touching a leaking roof or a collapsed anchor tenant. That spreads risk across dozens or even 100 properties at once, which is a very different game from the one facing a private buyer who puts everything into one building, in one town. Say the purchase price seems reasonable and you close the deal. Before you collect a single rent check, a layer of hidden costs catches almost every new owner off guard. You inherit the anchor leases as they are, and those leases were often signed decades earlier for shockingly low rent, with years still left to run before you can renegotiate. Then there's deferred maintenance. Roofs, HVAC systems cooling over 1 million square feet, cracked parking lots, elevators, all wearing out quietly if the previous owner was cutting corners to keep the books looking good. And buried in nearly every lease are co-tenancy clauses, contract terms that let smaller tenants pay reduced rent or walk away entirely the moment a major anchor closes. You don't see that cost on closing day. You see it the day the anchor leaves, when a dozen other leases suddenly reopen beneath your feet. Here's where it gets interesting, because a mall makes money in more layers than most people realize. The simplest layer is base rent, a fixed monthly amount priced per square foot. A specialty store might pay somewhere around $40 to $60 per square foot per year in a strong mall. An anchor department store, by contrast, often pays a tiny fraction of that. Analysts who studied Sears leases before its bankruptcy found the company paying around $5 per square foot, while other tenants at top malls were paying $50 or $60. The store with the biggest sign and the most floor space was paying roughly a tenth of what the shop next door paid per square foot, because the anchor isn't really renting space, it's renting out its name and foot traffic that name pulls in. Every smaller tenant is in effect subsidizing that discount by paying full price to stand near it. The second layer is percentage rent, money tied directly to sales. A store might pay its base rent, but once its yearly sales cross a set breakpoint, the mall takes a cut, often around 6 or 7% of everything sold above that line. If a store's breakpoint sits at $1.5 million and it sells $2 million, the mall collects a slice of that extra $500,000 automatically. The third layer is common area maintenance, or CAM, where tenants split the cost of running the building itself cleaning, lighting, security, escalators, based on how much space each one occupies. If shared costs for the year total $250,000 and a tenant holds 10% of leasable space, that tenant owes $25,000 of it. A large share of what it costs to physically run the mall gets billed straight back to the tenants themselves. Then there's a fourth category almost nobody pictures at all: parking fees in dense urban malls, advertising space on digital screens, kiosks parked in the middle of the walkway. A kiosk selling sunglasses might occupy less than 100 square feet, and yet because it sits directly in the busiest stretch of foot traffic in the whole building, it can be priced at a far higher rate per square foot than a full storefront along the wall. Position in this business is worth more than space. So far, the mall looks like a machine printing money from 4 directions at once. Now the other side of the ledger. Keeping over 1 million square feet climate-controlled, lit, and staffed around the clock is one of the largest recurring expenses in commercial real estate. Add security, cleaning contracts, landscaping, snow removal, constant small repairs, property taxes that can be one of the single biggest line items of the year, and insurance premiums that have been climbing sharply across the industry, especially on older buildings. And there's a detail buried in the CAM structure that ambushes new owners. Those shared costs don't shrink just because part of the mall sits empty. The hallways still get cleaned, the lights above a vacant storefront still burn, security still patrols the whole building. When vacancy rises, that same fixed pool of expenses gets split among fewer paying tenants, so every remaining store's bill climbs, even though nothing about the upkeep changed, which is exactly the pressure that pushes the next marginal tenant out the door, too. And here's the trap almost nobody sees coming until they own the place. Even a mostly full mall can lose money if the mix is wrong. A mall might look 90% occupied and feel perfectly healthy, but if half that space is anchors paying almost nothing, and a growing share of the rest are on short-term discounted leases just to keep the lights on, the real cash flow can be far weaker than the occupancy number suggests. Occupancy is not the same thing as income, and that gap is where a lot of mall owners get into serious trouble. It helps to understand why malls are built the way they are in the first place. The developer most credited with the modern American mall was a Michigan builder named Alfred Taubman, who studied exactly how people move through a building and designed around it. He spaced anchor stores roughly 3 city blocks apart, so shoppers walking between them passed dozens of smaller shops along the way. He put escalators at the ends of corridors instead of the middle, forcing people to walk the full length to reach them. He mixed skylights with artificial lighting so shoppers couldn't easily tell how much daylight had passed. None of it was decoration, because that exposure is what the smaller tenants are really paying rent for. Now the structural risk running through the whole business. For most of the 20th century, department stores like Sears were the backbone of the American mall, so essential that banks wouldn't finance construction without one signed up first. But starting in the 2000s and accelerating after 2010, those department stores began closing fast. Sears, once the largest retailer in the country, with roughly 4,000 stores at its peak, filed for bankruptcy in October of 2018. One major mall owner had Sears in 59 of its properties, another in 40, and roughly 80% of all Sears stores nationwide sat inside regional malls. Remember the co-tenancy clauses. When an anchor closes, it doesn't just remove one rent check, it can trigger a wave of rent cuts across dozens of stores at once. All from contract language written years earlier, when everyone assumed that anchor would stay forever. And refilling that anchor box isn't fast or cheap. These buildings were built for one kind of tenant, sometimes over 100,000 square feet, with loading docks that don't easily convert into anything else. One mall owner spent $100 million over 3 years just subdividing a single old department store into 4 smaller stores. Multiply that across dozens of empty anchor boxes at once, which is exactly what happened when Sears closed hundreds of stores simultaneously. And you understand why analysts said that bankruptcy would cause pain for mall owners for years, not months. A mall doesn't fail because business is bad everywhere. It fails because one piece falls out. and the rest of the structure was quietly built to depend on that piece staying in place. Rolling Acres Mall shows exactly how that plays out. It opened in Akron, Ohio in August of 1975 with Sears as its first anchor and about 20 stores around it. Within years, it had grown past 140 stores with 5 different anchors, a movie theater, and a food court. By the mid-90s, when a new Target store was added, the mall was reported to be about 98% occupied. Then, slowly, the anchors started leaving. A newer, renovated competitor opened nearby in the late 90s and pulled shoppers away. Target relocated. Dillard's closed. One remaining anchor was rebranded twice within 2 years before finally shutting for good. By 2006, occupancy had collapsed and the property sold for $1.6 million, a building once valued at well over $30 million. The interior officially closed in 2008, though 2 anchors kept trading through separate outside entrances for a few more years. Sears closed in 2011. The last tenant, a J.C. Penney outlet, closed at the end of 2013, and from there the building sat completely empty. Scrappers tore out the copper wiring. One man died from electrocution trying to steal copper from a power box outside the mall. Vandals broke the skylights, letting rain and snow pour in for years, rotting the floors from the inside. The city of Akron eventually seized the property after the owners stopped paying property taxes, owing more than $1 million by the time the city stepped in. The building was demolished in stages between 2016 and 2019. Amazon later built a distribution center on the same land, a mall that was 98% occupied at its peak took less than 2 decades to become a pile of rubble and a warehouse. And the line between those two states wasn't one dramatic event, it was a sequence of smaller ones, each making the next more likely. None of this happened in a vacuum. It happened while online shopping was eating an ever larger share of retail spending. For most of the 20th century, a mall's real product wasn't the stores, it was convenience. The only place in town where you could compare 5 brands of shoes in one afternoon. Online shopping broke that monopoly completely, letting shoppers compare hundreds of options from a couch with delivery in a day or two. The malls that struggled most were the ones stuck in the middle, not upscale enough to sell an experience the internet couldn't match, not cheap enough to compete purely on price. The owners who kept their properties alive did it by changing what they sold. Instead of leasing to more clothing retailers, many filled old anchor boxes with things a screen can't replace. Restaurants that need a physical table, gyms, urgent care clinics, co-working space, movie theaters and indoor entertainment, even apartments and hotels carved into former retail wings. A mall used to sell products. The ones that survived started selling reasons to physically leave the house. So does owning a mall actually work as a business? It depends entirely on which mall, and the gap between the good outcome and the bad one is enormous. In the optimistic scenario, a well-located mall with strong anchors, heavy foot traffic, a healthy mix of restaurants and services, and low vacancy produces steady, predictable income every month through base rent, percentage rent, and CAM reimbursements, with property values that climb as the surrounding neighborhood grows. That outcome built some of the largest real estate companies on the stock market and made men like Alfred Taubman into billionaires. In the realistic bad year scenario, one major anchor closes, co-tenancy clauses trigger, a handful of smaller tenants renegotiate down or simply leave when their leases expire, while utilities, insurance, and property taxes keep rising regardless of how many stores are open, because those bills are tied to the size of the building, not its occupancy. The empty anchor box sits there for a year, 2 years, sometimes far longer, earning nothing while still needing to be secured and maintained. And the same fixed CAM pool now spreads across fewer paying tenants, so even the loyal stores quietly pay more to keep the lights on in emptier hallways. The difference between those 2 years for the exact same building is the difference between a growing asset and one heading toward Rolling Acres' ending. Rolling Acres itself lived the optimistic version first, nearly full, 5 anchors, over 100 stores, a beloved local landmark, before sliding into the realistic version and never recovering. The building didn't change. The economics underneath it did. A mall looks from the outside like a building full of stores. From the inside, it's a single, tightly interconnected financial system, where every tenant's fortune is quietly tied to every other tenant's, whether they realize it or not. The anchor doesn't just sell appliances or clothing, it sells the foot traffic every smaller store depends on to survive. And when it leaves, it doesn't just leave a hole in the floor plan, it pulls the financial floor out from under everyone standing near it. The building was never really the business. The people walking through it always were.